We talked last week about companion planting and some of the myths around what it means and what specific plants maybe aren't good to plant together. I promised this week that we would go into the actual techniques of how to do this in our own gardens in terms of interplanting. One of the main methods that I use in my own garden and in helping my clients in their gardens, and what I teach in my Plan Like a Pro course, is high, low, fast, slow. This little mantra is a really great way to combine the plants in your garden to make the most use of all of your space without impeding on the growth of any of the plants involved. Now, when done successfully, not only are you taking advantage of mixing the species up to help with pest pressure, you are also providing better diversity in the garden in terms of your soil and getting more out of the same garden space. When done incorrectly, though, we can choke out our plants, cause some disease issues, invite pests in because we have weak plants, and ultimately this is going to reduce our yield. So, today on Just Grow Something, I'm taking you through how to judiciously combine plant families in your garden beds so that you can make the most of the space that you have while also benefiting your plants and the soil therein. I will also give you specific examples of how this is working out in my own gardens right now, plus a few experiments that I'm doing, so maybe you can be inspired to do the same in your own garden. Let's dig in. Hey, I'm Karen, and what started as a small backyard garden 20 years ago turned into a lifelong passion for growing food. Now, as a market farmer and horticulturist, I want to help you do the same. On this podcast, I am your friend in the garden, teaching evidence-based techniques to help you grow your favorites and build confidence in your own garden space. So grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. So a few notes about the merch shop over at justgrowsomething.com before we move on. I am getting ready to launch the new spring and summer items in the next week or so. I've got a couple of new designs. And at the same time, I am going to be retiring a few of the existing designs. There are some designs that have been in there for a while, and there will be a little bit of overlap for a couple of weeks, but then when I retire those, they're going to be gone for the foreseeable future. So I invite you to check it out now to decide which of the current designs you might like. And then check back again when the new designs drop. Like I said, there will be some overlap for a couple of weeks to let everybody get in there and kind of make purchases all at once instead of, trying to buy and then going back in. So anyway, there are some current designs that will transition from like being hoodies and long sleeved into t-shirts and tanks and some other fun things, in addition to adding some new designs. So I wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to go in there before your favorites go away, or ones that maybe you've been waiting on. That's going to happen here in the next couple of weeks. So justgrowsomething.com, and then just click the shop button, or you can type in /shop. And huge shout out to those of you who have already made purchases in the merch shop. I don't make a ton of money off of it, but it's a really great way to support the show, and it's kind of a fun way for me to have a little bit of a creative outlet in like gardening themed things. So I'm hoping that you like the new designs. You'll have to reach out and let me know. All right, so what exactly is interplanting and why does it matter in our garden? Let's start with the basics. Interplanting or intercropping, we're going to use those terms interchangeably, is the practice of growing two or more crops in the same space at the same time. And we're doing that in a way that they don't compete with each other, but they complement each other instead. So this is a little bit different from what we talk about in terms of succession planting, even though we can use all of these techniques all at the same time. Succession planting is more about the timing of the plants. So planting one crop right after another in the same space. Interplanting is more like roommates that actually get along, right? Sometimes they're together for just a short amount of time, and sometimes they are together for the entire season. Now, when they're only together for a short period of time, in traditional like farming terminology, we talk about it that being relay planting. So interplanting would be making sure that all the plants are growing together for the entire season. Relay planting would be planting one crop by itself, and then as that starts to mature, then planting another crop in it. And then that early crop comes out while the later crop goes to maturity. That is considered relay planting. We are going to use those terms. I'm just all of that is falling under interplanting as far as I'm concerned. So if I say interplanting, understand that it could also mean relay planting in some way, shape, or form. You may also hear me say intercropping. Intercropping and interplanting are the exact same technique. It's just that intercropping is, again, the sort of big ag version of what we're doing here. Interplanting is just it being scaled down for use in gardeners' terms. I will use those terms interchangeably as well. So intercropping, interplanting, exact same thing. Interplanting and relay planting, I am just letting relay planting fall under the umbrella of interplanting just for, convenience sake in terms of this conversation, okay? So if you hear those terms elsewhere, understand that, these are all things that we are talking about interchangeably. When it is done well, interplanting is going to increase your harvest using the exact same amount of space that you already have. This is a beautiful way to really increase the harvest from your garden without having to add more bed space, whether that means building new raised beds or breaking up the ground. This isn't necessarily something that you will do in smaller containers. You can, in terms of sort of planting companions together, but that is when you really have to pay attention to the plant spacing. We'll talk about that in a little bit about how to manage that, but just understand that the smaller the container, the less likely it is that you are going to reap the benefits of this. You might just want to add new containers at that instance. One of the other benefits of interplanting done well is that it helps prevent weeds by either crowding them out completely or by just shading the soil so that nothing can grow there. It also reduces that pest pressure through the crop diversity. We talked about that in the companion planting episode last week. Intermixing all of the species together or different species of plants together is going to break up that monocrop or that monoculture, and it makes it less likely that pests are going to really hone in on that one particular thing that they're looking for, because they can't find it as easily if they have more than, one species that they might land on, right? Interplanting is also going to improve our soil health. So if we have multiple species, that is supporting multiple types of beneficial microbes in the soil. The different root diversity of all of these different types of crop are also going to help to improve the soil texture. So you have plants with very, very fine roots going through the soil, but then you also have ones with larger tap roots that are breaking up compacted soil. You've got the fine roots that are sort of filling in those air gaps a little bit, larger roots that are breaking it up. So it really does help with the soil texture to have a variety of root types in the same space. Now, I keep saying when done correctly. So we'll talk about the high, low, fast, slow strategy here in a minute. But one of the things that we need to take into consideration when we're doing this is our individual plant spacing. This is where it tends to get very, very confusing for people. And it was very confusing for me. And I have worked on this technique for years and years and years. And I finally sort of figured out the recipe for a super productive garden in the same space by combining these plants. When we think about it in terms of plant spacing, we're still going to follow the proper spacing techniques and the proper spacing recommendations from the seed packet, but we are going to follow it based on that particular plant. And we might be filling in that plant spacing with something completely different. This is why it is very important to do this in different plant families, using different plant families, because in a lot of instances these plants at the same stage of growth are going to be using different nutrients. They might have a different demand level for that particular nutrient, and so they're not going to be necessarily sharing the same resources, and if they are sharing the same resources, they're doing it for a limited amount of time. So, for example, if you have a crop that says it's recommended that it is planted 6 inches apart in the row and in rows that are 18 inches apart, you can do this in a number of ways. you can follow that recommendation by planting them 6 inches apart and then doing another row 18 inches from that and planting those plants 6 inches apart in that row. And then pairing a crop with those plants that will fit in between the rows. Or you can plant these more in a grid. So the square foot gardening method is infamous for this. This is kind of the basis behind square foot gardening, where you're breaking your garden up into 12-inch squares and how many of a particular plant can fit into that 12-inch square. What I'm going to recommend is something that's very similar to that. I don't necessarily utilize square foot gardening, but what I do is just kind of take the average of the amount of space that is recommended for that plant, and then I just divide it into two. So how does this work? If that same plant, you're saying it needs to be 6 inches apart in the row, and those rows need to be 18 inches apart, that 18 inches plus the 6 inches, right now we have 24 inches. Essentially, that plant, if you divide that by 2, needs 12 inches on all sides of itself in order to be able to do the growth that it needs up top or underneath, or to spread its roots out and utilize the nutrients appropriately. So if you don't want to do rows, you don't have to. Especially if you're doing these in raised planters, you can say, I'm going to take that crop and I'm going to take that crop. I'm going to take that crop and I am going to space them out 12 inches apart. Now what you can do is either you can, again, fill in spaces in between with something different that is going to utilize opposite nutrients or have a different growth pattern, or you can sort of do this like in a checkerboard pattern, for instance. So if you want to grow, say, one that I reference a lot, which is lettuces in with your brassicas, right? Your brassicas are going to take up a lot more space eventually than your lettuce will. But your lettuce grows a lot more quickly than the brassicas. So these are perfect to pair together, right? So if that brassica, say, needs 18 inches all the way around it in order to get to its full size and in order to utilize the nutrients properly in the soil, then you can go ahead and space them. Okay, they're 18 inches apart, but instead of having it be just the brassicas, you might say, I've got one brassica here. Let's use, broccoli as an example. I've got one broccoli here, and then 18 inches over, I am going to place 2 lettuce plants, because maybe the lettuce only needs 6 inches apart, right? So that can take up this space on the side of where the broccoli is. So on either side of the broccoli, you might have lettuces. And then the next section over will be another broccoli, and then the next would be lettuces. So what happens is, as those broccoli, which grow more slowly than the lettuce, are coming to maturity, they slowly take up that space. In the meantime, the lettuces are filling out the area, which is helping to prevent those weeds from coming in and taking over. It's shading the soil. You're getting more of a harvest out of it because that space is not blank, just waiting for the broccoli to fill it. By the time the broccoli needs that space, you will have harvested that lettuce. It's already out of the way. And now the broccoli can take up the rest of the room that it needs to grow, okay? That is just one example of how you could do this. So just keep in mind with the plant spacing, yes, you do want to follow the recommended guidelines in terms of what they need in space to grow. But it is okay to fill in that space either temporarily or permanently with a different plant. And that takes more advantage of the amount of soil that you have to grow in, and it also helps to prevent the weeds, and it also helps to prevent the pests. So just combine whatever the recommendation is in terms of its spacing, and either decide if you're going to plant in between rows, or if you're going to add up the space that they need, divide by 2, and then you know how much space each one of those plants needs around them, and do it that way. This is why, especially like in Plan Like a Pro, I will tell people, take a spreadsheet, not a spreadsheet. Well, you can do it on a spreadsheet, but take a piece of graph paper and lay out your garden and do it in terms of each square is, 1 foot. Or if you have, an extraordinarily large garden, it could be 2 feet or whatever. And this will give you the opportunity to be able to write in what plants will fit in what space. If you are a visual person, this really, really does help lay things out in terms of, oh, now you can see what can fit where. If you're somebody who works sort of in formulas like I do, it may not be necessary to write these things out. You can just write a list and say, I'm going to pair broccoli and lettuce together. And when you do the math and you add up the space that each of those needs, you might also find that you have space to add something else, which is what I do. I put green onions in there as well. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can figure this out. What we need to concern ourselves with is the technique and how we can get to the point where we know what's going to go or what's going to stay in the garden for an extended period of time, what is going to come out to make room for that thing, or can they be side by side the entire time because one is really tall and the other is really low? And that is where the high, low, fast, slow strategy comes in. So this is actually just sort of my favorite way to keep in mind how you can pair these plants families up in your garden. If you have worked through the garden planning workbook that I sell in my shop, you will recognize this technique. If you have taken the Plan Like a Pro course, you will recognize this technique. So high, low, fast, slow. So what we're going to do is we are going to take our tall plants, our tall growing plants, these are our high plants, and we are going to pair them with low growing ones. Those are the shorter plants, okay? So planting a tall crop with a shorter one underneath lets us take advantage of the vertical spacing and also light layering. Because one of the reasons there are recommendations for how far apart or how closely together plants can be planted is that we also have to take into consideration how much light they need. So if you have plants that like to hold hands, like peppers like to be planted closely enough together to where they, their leaves are touching each other. But that's close enough. If you plant them too more closely together, then you might be not giving them enough light. But if they're close enough to where they can hold hands, the leaves from one plant can help shade the fruit of the other, and that way we're preventing sun scald. So that's just one example of, why plant spacing can be important. So if we're using a tall crop and we are planting a lower growing one underneath, it can either be just a short plant, or it can be one that is vining. So some examples of this are like tomatoes and basil. So basil grows well in part shade. So if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes that are going to continue getting taller all season long and they're trellising out, they are going to shade that bed pretty heavily. So you need to grow something in there that can stand having that shade. So basil is a perfect example of this. These are two things that will grow well together for the entire season. A different twist to this would be tomatoes and lettuces. So lettuce is a short growing plant, low growing plant. It is not going to stay in the garden the entire season. So as the tomatoes, or as you're growing your lettuces, they can take up the entire space where your tomatoes will go later in the season. Then, as the lettuces are maturing, you can plant those tomatoes in and amongst the lettuces. They're not going to bother the lettuce at all. As the tomatoes get taller, you can harvest the lettuces that are closest to the tomato plants so they get the chance to be able to grow. What will happen, especially if you are in an area where the late spring starts to get very warm very quickly, and sometimes your lettuce will either get bitter or will start to bolt because it gets too hot, the lettuces are going to start to get shaded by the tomatoes, which means that you might get a little bit more of an extended harvest out of your lettuces because they're getting that shade and they're not getting cooked in the sun. So they're not getting bitter and they're not bolting as quickly. Then, once you pull the lettuces out, you can, if you want to, plant something else underneath there like the basil that will still grow well in that part shade. Or you can just leave it empty, make sure that you've mulched it really well, and then plant lettuces again later in the late summer, again taking advantage of the height of the tomatoes to help to shade them, while they continue to grow through the late summer into the fall. So those are just two examples of, a high and a low that aren't necessarily vining crops. We're not looking at covering the entire ground. We're looking at something that can tolerate the shade that is being given by that taller plant without impeding the growth of either plant. If we want to look at vining crops, then the Three Sisters method is a classic version of that, right? So we have corn. We're planting the corn first, and we're allowing it to start growing straight up. That is our high or our tall plant, right? The next thing we're going to do is we can plant beans. Now, the beans aren't necessarily, yes, they're a high plant, they're a tall plant. They're going to use the corn as a stalk to grow up. So we're talking about pole beans specifically here. So they're good companions, like we talked about last week, because the corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder, and those beans are going to fix the nitrogen, and then the corn is providing the stability for the bean to be able to climb up. But the interplanting here that is going to benefit the soil in terms of keeping the weeds out is the squash. So if you plant a vining squash at the base of those corn plants and the bean plants, now that corn or that squash is going to crawl across the ground and it's going to act as a living mulch. So it's going to keep the weeds at bay that would interrupt the growth cycle of the corn and the beans. So when all three of these are working very, very well together and they are all benefiting each other. Something else that you could do would be high-low, would be cucumbers on a trellis with lettuce or some other leafy green underneath. So you've got a trellis and you're planting the cucumbers at the base. Well, cucumbers generally need to be planted later in the season a little bit when the soil has warmed up. So lettuces are a great thing to plant in that space in the meantime. So the lettuces like the cooler temperatures. They're going to shade out that soil and they're going to crowd out any weeds that might want to start to develop there. As you harvest the first round of lettuces, then you can plant the cucumbers against the trellis where the lettuces came out, but the remaining lettuces can stay in that soil to continue to choke out the weeds while the cucumber starts to climb. The cucumbers take a while to climb and to leaf out. So the lettuce is going to mature in the meantime, and it's not going to be choked out by the cucumbers. And by the time the cucumbers start to mature and start vining everywhere where they're going to cover the soil themselves, the lettuce is already out, okay? What is important here is the light management, but also our nutrient management. So your tall crops are eventually going to create shade. So you have to plan what goes beneath them accordingly. It either needs to be a crop that prefers some protection from the sun, or one that is going to be finished by the time that shade becomes an issue. The other thing when we're talking about nutrient issues is we want to make sure that they are not really, really heavy feeders at the same time. So if we're planting lettuces initially are going to want a good amount of nitrogen for their leaf development. If we're planting tomatoes into the lettuces, yes, the tomatoes are also going to want nitrogen at the beginning for that leafy growth and to get those stems nice and strong. But by the time the soil is warm enough to put those tomatoes in to where the lettuces are, the demand that the lettuce has on the nitrogen capacity of the soil has lessened by that point. So there is more nitrogen available for those tomatoes. We just want to be cognizant that if we do have heavy feeders together, it's not necessarily a done deal that you can't do it. You just have to make sure that you have the soil fertility to be able to handle that. So if you need to feed your soil a bit more when you have these plants growing together, then that's just what you do. Almost any of these combinations can be done very well so long as you know that you have the nutrients available, okay? So that's high-low. What about fast-slow? Well, we sort of talked about that a little bit with the lettuces and the tomatoes, but this is just another way to pair, your crops together. We have a fast maturing one with a slower one so that the fast maturing crop gets to thrive while the slower one is taking its time getting to size. And by the time the slower one takes over the entire space, the fast maturing one has gotten out of the space. Radishes and carrots are a classic example of this. Radishes germinate and mature much more quickly than radishes do, or than carrots do, sorry. And we all know carrots are divas. They take forever to germinate. They need specific temperatures and specific soil moisture and all those types of things. And it can be sometimes as long as 3 weeks for them to just even start to pop up out of the soil, and they grow much more slowly. So if you mix radishes, you do a row of carrots on either side and you do a row of radishes down the middle. You can do your normal spacing with the carrots in between, right? So if, let's say, off the top of my head, it might be like 18 inches between rows of carrots. If you do 2 rows with the 18 inches like you're supposed to in between them, there is nothing wrong with taking a row of radishes right down the center between those 2 rows of carrots. Those radishes are going to pop up within a matter of a couple of days. This is going to remind you of exactly where your rows of carrots are, number one, while they are taking forever to pop their little heads up out of the ground. But radishes mature so quickly in as early as 3 weeks, right? 3 to 4 weeks, those radishes are going to be up and out, and the carrots will finally be up in a solid stand where you can see them and you know what to do with them, and the carrots will start to take over. The benefit of the radishes also is that it is helping to keep that soil loosely cultivated, which is what carrots need to reach their full potential. So the radishes are kind of keeping that soil from becoming sort of not really impacted, but kind of crusty on the top, because when you're pulling the radishes out, you're disturbing that soil that's in between the carrots, and that is preventing them, from that top from kind of getting dry and crusty, which is also going to help with the carrot growth. We already talked about lettuce and tomatoes, right? Lettuce loves the cooler early season. It matures before the tomatoes start to full out. Things like spinach with broccoli. If you like the baby leaf spinach, you can grow the leaf spinach in between rows of your broccoli or in and around the base of the broccoli. The broccoli, takes a while for it to kind of get situated and start to leaf out. The spinach grows very quickly in the spring. So if you want to harvest a bunch of baby spinach, you can do that multiple times off of a little spinach crop in and amongst your broccoli while you're waiting for the broccoli to take over. You don't even necessarily need to remove that spinach when the broccoli does take over. If it gets shaded enough to where it's not going to grow anymore, then it's at that point it's just acting like a ground cover. And as it dies back, it's going to feed the soil. So you don't necessarily have to pull that crop out. You can just let it be. But in the meantime, you can be harvesting that spinach while you're waiting on the broccoli to grow. So this technique keeps the weeds at bay because your fast growing crop is going to cover that bare soil early on, and it's also reducing wasted space while you wait for your slow growers to mature. I've talked a couple of times this season about how I'm focusing on beautifying my gardens rather than just strictly relying on production value this year. Now, production value makes sense for me because I'm a market farmer and my companion planting and my intercropping all serve some sort of a purpose in that regard. But I'm looking a little bit more at adding plants for aesthetics this season. That is where Heirloom Roses comes in. Not only do they have over 700 varieties of fabulous own root roses to choose from, they also have a myriad of other perennials to add pops of color all over my garden. I am using their very robust search function to narrow down the selection of plants based on what is perennial in my Zone 6 garden and what will do well in containers. The kitchen garden is my main focus this year, and that entire garden is raised planters because the soil underneath is really just cheap dirt that's been dumped on top of gravel, and I'm not sure anything will actually grow there. So I want to use containers between my beds to add all this beauty that I'm looking for. Heirloomroses.com has made it very easy to just find not just container friendly perennials for my zone, but also those in specific color ranges and various bloom times, so I can be sure that I have color all season long. I have just clicked the little heart right next to each one that I like, and it adds it to my wish list, and then I can see all of my favorites in one spot so I can narrow down my choices, which has been kind of difficult because they are all so beautiful. And each of the perennials comes in a 1 gallon pot, but they'll hold those plants until the optimum time for me to plant, which is after May 14th. So they are keeping me from planting too early and possibly damaging my new plants. They do truly care about our success with their plants. To save 20% on your purchase, head to heirloomroses.com and use code JUSTGROW at checkout to find not just healthy, disease-free roses, but other perennials to beautify your garden this year. Heirloomroses.com with code JUSTGROW. The link is in the show notes. So, what about pest and weed management with interplanting? We talked about this last week with the companion planting. A diverse planting is a strong planting. When you interplant, you disrupt pest behavior by breaking up the monoculture, okay? So, yes, this is a form of companion planting. We might want to be using plants strategically because of maybe how the pests will react to them. So, for example, onions or garlic in with your carrots, because the strong scent of the alliums can help to confuse, the carrot rust flies. This might be in terms of chemical exudates, right? So marigolds in with tomatoes because they're not just adding color, but they're also repelling the nematodes. But we can also do this in terms of just different species being together, okay? We know that basil pairs well with tomatoes just, in terms of flavor, but there is something that suggests that the volatile oils from the basil may also help reduce some pest pressure. But it certainly introduces a different species into the tomato crop, again, disrupting that monoculture. So, in terms of interplanting and confusing insect pests, the more plant species the merrier, right? The better off we are if we are mixing things that aren't in the same family. So even though texturally speaking peppers are different from tomatoes, they are both nightshades. They are in the same family. They're going to attract the same pests oftentimes. They also are going to attract the same diseases oftentimes. This is even more so when we talk about like tomatoes and potatoes. These are not things that we want to mix together. We don't want to mix kale in with our cauliflower because they are both brassicas and they attract the same pests. We do want to mix things that are not in the same family, and the more diversity also means more habitat for predatory insects and for pollinators. So you're also encouraging beneficials when you are mixing these plant species together. We also want to look at that weed suppression. Crops that cover the ground, like squashes or low growing things like lettuces. These act as living mulch. They shade the soil, they reduce the weed seed germination. Interplanting makes this easier because you don't leave long stretches of like bare ground for the weeds to move in. If you look out in nature, it is going to be very rare for you to find bare soil. This is why I talk so much about mulch, but the same concept applies to interplanting. The only time that you really see bare soil out in nature is for only a handful of reasons. The first one might be allelopathy of some sort. So if you take, for example, walnut trees, you're oftentimes going to see bare soil around the base of the walnut trees because they do have some allelopathic properties in the living tissue. So your roots and your leaves and stuff that prevent other plants from trying to grow there. But in most instances, it has to do with either a very, very dense canopy that only supports certain plants, and therefore those plants are more sparse. But there are still plants there, right? It's not completely bare soil. You go into the forest and there is a ton of heavy canopy cover that really, really shades you. There are still plants growing in that canopy cover, right? Most of the time, if we see bare soil, it is because there has been some sort of natural disaster. So either a fire or a flood or a mudslide of some sort took all of those plants out. But very, very quickly, after a natural disaster happens, the advantageous plants start to move in. So these are the ones that can spread very, very easily. They germinate very quickly and they grow very quickly. They get established very fast. This is Mother Nature's way of covering that bare soil so that you don't lose any more bare soil. These are plants that the seeds can fly in very easily on the breeze. They land, they germinate very quickly, and they are holding that soil in place. While the main plants that generally would grow there, the longer lasting plants, the ones that really need to get their roots in, can take their time to get in there. So eventually what happens is those sort of advantageous plants will eventually be choked out by the ones that really do need to be there, the native species that are deep rooted and that will generally rebuild the soil. Those early settling plants function as not just a way to hold the soil in place, but as they die off, they are feeding that soil, which means they are feeding the other plants that are moving in. And this is how, Mother Nature starts to rebuild the soil after some sort of a natural disaster. If we think about ourselves in terms of what we're doing in our gardens, we are the natural disaster, y'all. Okay. We are tilling up the ground. We are turning the soil over. We are stripping it of all of the native stuff that was there initially and starting to grow what we want to grow there. Okay. We are the natural disaster. We don't want to leave bare soil. So we want to cover that soil with the things that we want to grow there. Now we're acting as Mother Nature. We are putting the things in place that are going to protect that soil and keep it from moving or blowing away, and the things that are going to set deep roots and things that are going to feed that soil, right? So we're doing this in artificial means. We are either planting enough plants to where that soil is being covered, or in most instances, this is in combination with using mulch. So just because I'm doing this interplanting does not mean that I am not still covering my beds with straw or some other form of organic mulch. We don't want bare soil. If we leave bare soil, then those advantageous plants are going to blow in on the wind. Those are our weeds. And those are the things that we don't necessarily want there. So we're going to spend more time pulling those. I would rather spend my time harvesting spinach or lettuces or leafy greens or root vegetables from under the canopy of my taller plants than removing weeds. Okay? So we're still talking about using mulch, but interplanting is going to help us to cover that ground so that we have a living mulch that shades the soil and reduces that weed seed germination. So here is the key to all of this. This is not random planting. Strategic spacing is what makes interplanting work without compromising that airflow or increasing the disease risk. So if the plants are too close, they're going to compete for resources. If it's too open, then we're missing out on that space efficiency. So how do we balance it? Even though we have those recommendations, like we talked about already, of spacing on our seed packets or in our guides, we essentially just want to remember that we are planting for the mature size of our slowest growing crop. So whatever is going to be in place for the longest part of the season is what we are planting for in terms of space. Okay. Using the spacing on your seed packets or in your workbook is fine, but use it as a guide, not a rule. We want to adjust slightly based on our conditions and the plant type. We also want to make sure that we are orienting, and this I'm talking to my northern hemisphere gardeners here right now. If you're southern hemisphere, some of this is opposite. We want to orient our taller crops to the north side of our garden beds if you're in the northern hemisphere, because that's how we prevent too much shading of smaller crops. Now, sometimes this can be difficult if we are gardening in a very small space or we are using raised planters and we're trying to do multiple planters with the same sort of crop pairings, and we require a trellis. If there's a trellis on, the north side of one of these beds, but there's another bed that's on the north side of that, then we are sort of in danger of maybe shading things a little bit too much. So we just have to be strategic in how we orient our crops to make sure that we are not shading those smaller crops too much, right? Some of them will benefit from it, and that's how we can be strategic in this, but sometimes, it can be too much and they just won't grow properly. So one of the best things that you can do is to remove those crops as soon as they're done. This is sort of making room by planning ahead for, what is coming up. So for example, if we're planting, radishes and carrots together, we're harvesting the radishes, and that is clearing that space right as the carrots are beginning to come to size. We're picking the spinach or the early lettuce, and we're doing that before the broccoli needs that room. We're pulling up peas from, when they're done being harvested in the early summer, and we're replacing them with something else, with beans or cucumbers or something that can utilize that trellis. So we're thinking ahead as we're doing this. All of these transitions require planning. So when you are mapping out your beds, think in terms of Yes, we want to do these interplantings and we want to pay attention to our successions as well. So space it out in terms of what your crop that is going to be in place for the longest needs in terms of space, and then fill in around it. So every time that we are interplanting thoughtfully, we are not just growing more. We're not getting that, just yield maximization. We are helping the soil to stay healthy. In terms of root diversity, different plants have different root depths and different patterns, right? So tap roots like carrots will break up that soil compaction. If you have fibrous roots from the lettuce or brassicas, these stabilize the surface of the soil and they encourage microbial activity. By mixing up the different root structures, you are improving the nutrient access for all of the plants. We are reducing erosion, and we're just building healthier microbial networks. So, healthier soil, healthier plants. Healthier plants, the better they are able to resist insect pressure. So, interplanting helps to stabilize the microclimate around your crops. This is reducing evaporation, it is reducing the wild temperature swings. You are creating your own little microclimate in your garden. So, this means, again, healthier plants and more consistent yields. So, more efficient use of space doesn't mean crowding as many plants in that you possibly can. It means timing and it means layering. So let me give you some examples of the pairings that I am doing in my garden this year, like right now, okay? Of course, I've always got carrots and radishes together. So I've got individual rows of carrots in my raised planters. I have radishes in between those. As I'm thinning those radishes out, the carrots are getting more space, but I also have chives planted on either ends of those raised planters, and those are permanently in place. Those are perennials that come back every year, and that is something that I'm experimenting with a little bit in terms of my companion plantings, is planting perennials that act as my companions to help with insect pressure, and then just planting the beds accordingly, right? So this year it's carrots and radishes, and there's chives on the ends. One of my favorite sort of pairings that I'm doing this year is I have 5 beds that all have trellises that are created out of cattle panel. And if you know what cattle panel is, they're like, 5 foot tall fence panels that are meant to keep cattle in, but they're held up with T-posts. And so I have these long rows of those cattle panels, and there is bed space that's wide in between each of them. So I have planted sugar snap peas all along those fence panels, and I have done that on the, I have to get my bearings here, on the west side of those panels, right? This is in a field where those panels are running north to south. And so, of course, the sun is coming up on one side and it's going on the other. And so it's a full sun area. So the peas are being planted on the west side of those trellises. And then I have lettuces that are planted in the beds that are adjacent to those panels. So the peas are just now sort of slowly trying to grow up those panels. The lettuces are all filling in between. But as the season continues, I'm going to be transplanting my tomatoes in, and they are going to go on the other side of the trellises. So they are going to be on the east side of the trellises. So what's going to happen is the peas are going to grow, and they are going to provide the lettuces and those baby tomato plants eventually with some afternoon shade. As the sun comes up and it moves from the east to the west, the afternoon sun is going to shine down on those trellises. And at the hottest part of the season, the spring anyway, the peas are going to shade those lettuces. It gives me a little bit more time to get those lettuces out of there. The tomatoes in their early, stages can benefit from that afternoon shade too, because it can tend to be really, really hot in that field. But once the peas are done, I'm going to cut those pea plants down and I'm going to leave the roots in the soil. So we've talked about what legumes can do to our soil. They harvest, we have nodules, right? There's beneficial bacteria that create nodules on the roots of legumes that enable the plant to capture atmospheric nitrogen, utilize it, trap it in those nodules. We chop those plants down, we leave those roots with the nodules in the soil, and as it breaks down, it re-releases that nitrogen back into the soil. And what do tomatoes like? They like nitrogen. So they're going to use that nitrogen as they are maturing and before they start, giving their fruit or producing their fruit. So, and in the meantime, I can finish harvesting all of those lettuces, and then the tomatoes get to take full advantage of the trellises. As we get into the late summer, I can plant lettuces again in that same space because once again, now the tomatoes are fully mature and they are going to provide the shade in the afternoon for those lettuces in order to be able to get through the hottest part of the late summer to survive to get to fall. Okay, so peas with lettuces into tomatoes, back into lettuce again, all in one space. I love it. And I'm going to take some pictures of this and kind of post about it as it goes on. So I will do some reels and some YouTube shorts so you guys can see that stuff. The next one is my classic. Okay, I got my cabbages, right? I have lettuces planted with the cabbages. I have onions in terms of green onions down the center of all of that. And then I have sweet alyssum growing as a living mulch underneath. So this is doing all kinds of things in terms of confusing insect pests and bringing in beneficials and just giving us a real wide diversity of plants in the same bed. I have done beets. So we started the beets first in their rows as the beets were coming up. And these are, again, these are in raised planters. The beets came up, and then in between the rows of the beets, I have planted kale or I have planted kohlrabi. So we've got that sort of, the beets are underneath. So at that point, we're kind of considering them the low growing ones. They're lower down. And then we have the kale that's growing above or the kohlrabi that is growing above. So neither one of them is impeding on the other. The beets are going to end up coming out first, the ones that are paired with the kale, right? The beets will come out first. The kale will get to stay in place because I harvest kale sort of long term. So I'm harvesting the larger leaves, the larger outer leaves, letting the center continue to grow. So it's there for an extended period of time, months in the season, just continuing to harvest. And it's getting taller and taller, and eventually it just looks like a little palm tree. There's nothing at the bottom, there's all the leaves at the top. But continuing to harvest off of that. As I am harvesting off of that, and as soon as the soil warms up, I am planting cucumbers on the north side of those beds. So there will be a trellis there, and the cucumbers will start to grow up that trellis, but they will also vine out across the soil. So they are going to be kind of in and amongst that kale. By the time the kale is tall enough, the cucumbers can sort of intertwine underneath. Now, this is going to take a little bit of management on my part to make sure that the cucumbers don't grow to the point where they're choking out the kale. So this is a little bit experimental, but I can also, fully harvest the kale if I want to and remove it completely if it doesn't seem like that pairing is working. I'm doing the same thing with the ones that have the kohlrabi planted in between, but the kohlrabi is likely going to mature either before or at the same time as the beets. So it's very possible that those will be completely removed as the cucumbers begin to grow. So these are two different pairings that are a little bit newer for me, and it's just a matter of sort of managing the space as the cucumbers grow. Another one that I'm doing is I have beds of or rows of pak choi, which I harvest some of it as baby bok choy, but I do the really big heads of bok choy. And in between those, I have rows of baby spinach that is coming up. So the spinach is growing right now. The pak choi takes a little bit longer to come to maturity, so I can have a ton of harvest of spinach off of that while I'm waiting for the pak choi to come up. And then I've got that planted with borders of pansies and euphorbia. With zucchini, I'm doing nasturtiums in and amongst the zucchini. I am doing basil and rosemary and marigolds in and amongst my tomatoes in another area. I've got some beds where I did dill all around the edges, and as the dill came up, I have now planted bush beans in the center. As the bush beans mature later on, I will transition that to kohlrabi for the fall. So this is a good example of interplanting that is also a succession planting because I've already got my fall succession planned out. In some of the beds, I have salad turnips that are growing right now, and in between those rows, I will be transplanting eggplant and marigolds. So eventually the salad turnips will come out and the eggplant and the marigolds will take over the entire space. But in the meantime, I have something taking up the space in between those rows. Now, what am I experimenting with? We talked a little bit last week about sunflowers and the fact that they are allelopathic to a certain extent to a lot of other plants. And I'm experimenting with exactly how closely I can plant things next to the base of sunflowers before they are affected by this. So I have two sections where I am doing sunflowers, and I am going to experiment at the base of one planting green onions. And green onions, mature fairly quickly. So I will know fairly quickly whether or not the sunflowers are kind of giving them a problem. The sunflower or the green onions go in first. Obviously, they're a cool weather plant. And as soon as the soil temperature is warm enough, I will be planting the sunflowers from seed. So the green onions should have plenty of time to get established before the sunflowers really start to come up. And then I'll be able to pull the green onions out before the sunflowers get to maturity. So I think that sort of relay planting style is actually going to work. The one that I'm really questioning is sunflowers with carrots. Just how close can I get? And it's a little bit, I'm planting the carrots a little bit later than what I normally plant carrots. And so the experiment here is to be planting the carrots, and then as the carrots come up, once the soil temperature starts to warm a bit, I can put the sunflowers directly in there. And again, I'm going to plant those sunflowers on the west side of the carrots so that they get shaded in the afternoon from that late afternoon, really hot sun. So can I plant them far enough away that they aren't negatively impacted by the sunflowers, but close enough to where they take advantage of the shade? That is the experiment. I will let you know how well that works. Another one that I'm doing is using mint as weed suppression under lettuce and collards that goes into a crop of cucumbers. I know most people are like, oh my gosh, don't plant mint because it takes over. That's kind of the point with this. So this is in a set of my Planter Box Direct planters. And I planted mint in those beds last year. And they've all come back up beautifully. And I chose chocolate mint, which is a fairly low growing sort of sprawling type of peppermint. And each of those beds right now either has head lettuces. So I didn't do loose leaf lettuces knowing that the mint would probably choke that out. I did head lettuces, which tend to have a more upright growth habit, so I can direct the mint around the lettuces. I also did collards. So again, larger growing plant that is going to stay in place for an extended period of time because I harvest off the larger leaves off the outside and allow the center to continue to grow. So they're going to get a bit taller, so they should be able to lift themselves up and away from the mint without being choked out. So eventually the lettuces are going to come out completely, and I will be planting cucumbers. Now in this space, I'm going to transplant the cucumbers rather than direct sowing them so that they don't have to compete as heavily with that mint. And the hope is that the mint not only acts as a living mulch at the base of the plants, but also you have that really strong scent of the mint that maybe will help with the cucumber beetles that I get plagued with. So we'll see how that goes. I will also be doing the same thing in with the collards. The collards are only planted along the south side of the bed, so the cucumbers will be planted in on the north side of that and grow up a trellis, which also, will help with, well, I guess it won't really help with shading because it's going to be on the north side. So it's not going to shade those collards, which is fine. The collards like the heat. It should be no problem. So it's just a matter of whether or not the cucumbers choke out the mint or if the mint interferes with the cucumbers in some way. So again, this is completely experimental. I have all kinds of beds that I'm doing these experiments with this year, right? And then we already talked about my trap crop experiment with the blue Hubbard squash to sort of draw the squash bugs and the squash vine borers away from my other summer squashes and zucchinis. So I've got the blue Hubbard squash, which is also being paired with marigolds that also attract squash bugs, plus some pheromone traps that also attract the squash vine borer. So we're hoping to use that sort of combination to help draw the insect pests away from the zucchini. I'm also doing a relay planting, which is one that I've done before, of my garlic and my onions that were planted in the fall. And as the soil warms up and it's time for the peppers to go in, peppers will be interplanted amongst the garlic and the onions. And by the time it's time to harvest the garlic and the onions in June, will be right about the time that the peppers really start to take off and start to increase in size. And so the hope is, again, which I've done this before, the garlic and the onions will help to repel some of the insect pests that might want to try to plague those peppers while they're in their infancy. And by the time the garlic and onions come out, the peppers are ready to go to maturity, okay? Some things that I don't companion plant with or I don't interplant with, things like okra. Okra grows tall. I tend to grow them in a fairly thick stand. So as long as I have some mulch underneath there, there's not really any type of a need for me to have any type of a intercropping with okra because it really does shade the entire bed out with its height and how sort of densely I plant them. So I've never seen any kind of real need to have anything mixed in with the okra. Plus, I don't really have any pests for okra in my area. Now, I don't plant huge, a whole acre of it by itself either. So it is, a bed that is mixed in with my other crops out there. So it's not really a monoculture in terms of it's the only thing that's being planted. There are other plant species out there. They're just not in the same bed. So if I think of something, or if you have, interplanted something with okra before, let me know. It might be something that I would like to try. The other thing that I don't really interplant anything with is potatoes, either sweet potatoes or Irish potatoes. They are all mulched with straw. But because I plant them in mounds or I plant them just directly into straw in the terms of the regular Irish potatoes, there's not really anything that I plant with it because, especially with sweet potatoes, they tend to take up the entire space fairly quickly and they need that room to vine. So I'm just giving them the space to do that, and they do that fairly quickly. So they will kind of cover that soil without any help from me. The same thing with the potatoes. They really will grow nice and tall and start to shade out anything that's on either side of those beds. And I use straw underneath there because I've never really found anything that I thought would make a really good interplanting with Irish potatoes. So there are some things that I don't interplant, but they are few and far between. Okay, I know this was a little bit of a longer episode, but I really wanted you to have the information so that you can really implement this because, if you haven't seen it done with your own two eyeballs, it is sometimes hard to grasp this concept. I end up getting a lot of blank stares from people when I talk at the farmer's market stand. I'm like, what do you mean plant it with this? And mostly it's because of the spacing issue. So think about, again, keeping that keeping that mantra in your brain: high, low, fast, slow. So pair your tall plants with your short ones and your fast growing plants with your slow ones, and that gives you more from every square foot that you are gardening in. Interplanting all of these different families together is going to help reduce your pests, and it's going to help reduce the weeds naturally. So you're going to have, worry less about having issues with those things. Thoughtful spacing is what we want to think about to ensure that airflow, and that also helps with disease prevention. So planning ahead is going to help you transition between your crops and keep in mind what the space is needed for your largest crop at maturity if you're keeping your beds full all season long. All of this together supports the soil health, it supports biodiversity, and gives us better yield. So start small. Maybe one bed where you try a couple of different combinations, or use some examples of what I provided so that you kind of have a foundation of things that have worked at least for somebody else before. Use your garden planning journal, or use my workbook or whatever to sketch it out, or at least write it out in terms of measurements. And don't forget to track your timing and your harvests so that you can fine tune this for next season. If you found any of this helpful, will you share it with a gardening friend? The way that this podcast grows is by people sharing that information with each other. And I really do think that this is one of those episodes or one of those concepts that can help so many people, especially if you are gardening in a small area, but also if they're dealing with pests or weed pressure. And if you haven't downloaded the garden planning workbook that I have, you can head to justgrowsomething.com. It's in the shop over there. You can grab your copy. You will find tools that will help you to maximize the yield from in your beds. Can you do it on the fly? Yeah. I do it. I do it all the time, but I've been doing this for a really long time. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're staring down at the garden bed and you go, there seems to be a lot of space in between these plants, that might be the perfect opportunity for you to try one of these techniques. Just remember to pinpoint the one thing that is going to be in that garden bed for the longest and figure out what size it is at maturity and then plan from there. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon.